Welcome everyone to Miss Wright's Read Aloud. We are continuing the story packs. We are starting today at chapter 16, which is one of Peter's chapters. When we last had heard from Peter, he was at Vola's place, and she had just got done telling about what it was like for her when she got back from working as a medic in the war. Chapter 16. That's enough. The words, along with Vola's hand on Peter's shoulder, were a welcome relief. His foot throbbed, his shoulders ached, and his armpits were so chafed that they were bleeding. 2 days of boot camp Vola, the secret name he'd christened the torture sessions in which he crouched uphill, dragged himself over stony ground on his elbows, and pitched mountains of hay balanced on one foot, had worn him out. He swung around to face the cabin, suddenly not even sure he could make it that far. But above the roof of the cabin, the hills were veiled with rain clouds. Night was coming. He thought of Pax, wet and cold. I could keep going. No, you'll undo the good if you push too fast. Peter nodded and took a step toward the cabin. But Vola shook her head. Not yet, she pointed to the barn. The third condition. The barn seemed impossibly far away. Peter looked back at the cabin. He wanted to fall into that hammock. He planted his crutch tips in a deliberate show. What is it? Nothing much. You're going to work some puppets for me. Marionettes. That sound too hard? Marionettes? I don't get it. You know what they are? Sure. He pictured the only ones he'd seen up close. Punch and Judy characters with long chins and sharp noses at a street fair where he'd been a little kid. Dead-eyed and skeleton-y as starving rats. The puppeteer had jerked them across the stage in twitchy rushes that had left him with nightmares for weeks. What about them? Vola eyed him for a moment before answering. Another true piece of myself I recovered. I remember that I'd made some marionettes for my little nieces when I was a teenager. I remembered how much I loved carving wood. She pulled 2 scarves from her overalls and handed them over with a sigh. Wrap those hand grips. You're still hanging off the crutches. Take the weight off your palms, child. Spread it to your arms, even when you're just standing there. Vola's unexpected kindness undid Peter. 1 minute she'd be barking at him for a dozen pull-ups or shooting her fingers in his face, warning him not to get too close. It was comfortable that way, like home. But the next minute she'd rub her salve on his aching shoulders, or sand the splinters off his crutches, or drop her chores to fix him a mug of hot chocolate, and he'd realized how much care she was putting into making him strong and mobile, and he felt guilty. He felt guilty now, winding the soft cloth around the hand grips, so he told her what he figured she wanted to hear. Your nieces must have been really happy to get such great presents. But he doubted it. Those nieces of hers probably stuffed those rat skeleton-y, dead-eyed puppets right into the trash the first night they'd gotten them. No bad dreams. Vola shrugged, but Peter could tell she was secretly pleased by his words, and his guilt eased. He arranged his weight on his sore palms to follow her to the barn. In the doorway, he paused to draw in the cool air. It smelled of wood and hay and linseed oil and varnish. All good scents, Peter thought, separating them out, and really good together. He swung inside. Vola crossed to the opposite wall, the one draped in burlap. Peter hung back. That wall had unnerved him the first day. She pulled the material aside, and he nearly lost his balance, as though what he had saw had hit him with a physical force. The puppets, marionettes, he could see now they were marionettes hanging off the wall, were spookily realistic, and yet nothing like he'd ever seen. He stepped closer and found his voice. Their eyes. My grandmother's jewelry. She had long jet necklaces. The pupils are filled with those beads. They flash in the light, make my friends seem alive. Peter fell silent again, and Vola didn't disturb him as he studied the creatures hanging in front of him. 5 were human, a king and a queen, a child, a pirate or sailor, and a sorceress. The rest animals. All the heads were wooden, nearly human-sized and huge-eyed, but the bodies were of a wide variety of materials. A tortoise was shelled with a green and orange gourd. Pine cone brackets formed the serpent's scales. And feathers. Almost all of the puppets were an assortment of feathers as hair or headdresses or cloaks or breeches. Loomed neatly over pegs besides each marionette was an array of dowels and paddles, strung together with thin black cord. In the center of the wall hung what Peter guessed was the largest puppet, covered by a separate piece of cloth. Vola removed it and he gasped. The great bird's wings were magnificent, probably a good 5 feet at full span. Hundreds of dark feathers gracefully overlapped each other in perfect rows, the tips painted red, as if licked with fire. Vola lifted it from its perch and carried it over to Peter. Most of the others are head and shoulder puppets, but this one needs to fly. I joined him at the elbow. When he soars, you almost feel the wind. Go ahead. You can touch him. Peter reached out. His fingertips stroked a sleek feathered shoulder, then a sharp wooden beak, painted a bright gold. The bird's eyes glittered, huge and black. He dropped his hand. So what do I have to do with this? Vola motioned to the hay bales. May as well sit down. I'm going to begin at the beginning. Peter sank onto a bale of hay, grateful for the rest. He watched as Vola hung the great bird back up. She put a small book from a niche in the wall, and then came and sat beside Peter, with it cradled in her hands. I killed someone. She looked up. Peter wasn't quick enough to cover his shock. She heaved a sigh, thick with disgust. No matter what Dableman lies they feed you about learning trades and reaching your potential, you're there to kill people. Kill or be killed. That's the contract in war. That wasn't true. His father, for example. You won't be fighting, right? Peter had pressed. His father had laughed and said no. He'd pretty much be doing what he did as a civilian, laying wires. Peter didn't bother correcting Vola, though, because the look on her face was so wrecked. You killed someone. I probably killed a lot of people, or at least contributed to their deaths. But this one I saw. After. I had to search his body. We were trained to look for weapons, anything we could use. I dropped to my knees. I had to touch him looking for those weapons. I remember being shocked at the feel of him. I was a medic, but I still half expected him to be plastic, not real. The way they taught us to think of our enemy in training. But of course he was warm. It was cold off and he was giving off warmth, as if his life was streaming out of him. And I was touching him without his permission. I'd murdered him, but what bothered me is he had lost the right to say yes or no about what happened to him. You probably think that's crazy, don't you? Peter's mouth had gone dry. He didn't know what to say. Then suddenly he thought of his kind-eyed therapist, and he did know. That must have been hard for you. Peter looked at him with a surprised relief on her face. She nodded. Suddenly I was desperate to know who he was, where he'd come from, what he cared about, who loved him. His mouth was open, as if he might have wanted to speak with me. I realized something then, that even though he was a man, and even though he was a different race, and even though he had grown up in a different country, we might still have had a lot in common. Important things, more important than which the army had drafted us. Two, but not two. But I'd killed him, so now we would never know. I searched his body, not for weapons, but for clues as to who he'd been. Vola went silent, her face so devastated that Peter wanted to look away. And this. Vola lifted the book. The 7 Voyages of Sinbad, part of the Arabian Nights series, in his pocket. He'd carried it into war, so it had to have meant something. An old copy, so probably it had been his favorite as a boy. Sinbad was brave, or maybe he thought it brought him courage, or maybe he just wanted to remember once that he had been a little boy and he had read books and felt safe. A page was bookmarked, the story of how Sinbad escapes from the rock's nest. I figured that story helped him believe that one day he'd escape too and get home. Vola got up. She lifted the great winged puppet off the wall again. The rock. This bird could snatch up elephants with its talons. Look at it. She carried the bird back to Peter and turned its beak to face him. Its gaze was so fierce that Peter shrank back. What do I have to do with this? He asked again. That book was so important to that soldier that he'd carried it to war. I figured since I'd taken his life, I owed him something. I owed it to him to tell the story that meant so much to him. I carved all these puppets, and I've been telling the story of Sinbad escaping from the rock here in my barn for nearly 20 years. Vola handed the control apparatus to Peter. And now, finally, I'm going to get to see what it looks like. Chapter 17. Pax watched Gray lap at the river's edge, then stumble back. For 2 days now, the foxes had rested across from the war-sick camp, but Gray had not gotten better. When the old fox reached the spicy shade of the hemlock bough, he collapsed. His eyes were hollow and glazed, and he barely flinched when Pax cleaned his neck some more. Pax found the wound even more inflamed. Stay hidden. Rest. He left Gray and climbed upstream to a place he discovered where the river narrowed beside a gorge wall, and the underbush beside it was dense enough that he could move about unseen by humans. He'd had a little luck hunting. The area was teeming with mice and rabbits, but they scampered from Pax's clumsy attach to catch them. Besides beetles and unripe berries, he'd been able to swipe only a few crayfish, which Gray had refused. For half an hour, Pax tried. He chased scurrying voles and hopping wrens, and once a sunning frog. But each time he sprang, his jaws snapped only around air. He grew hungrier with each failure. He wanted meat, for himself and for his weakened companion. The rich smells from the camp tormented him. He leaped into the water. The current was swift there, but midway across, 3 boulders rested against one another from a secure perch. From there, Pax had a clear view downstream to the humans. More had come. A few were women, most were men. Pax checked for his boy constantly because the father was still here and because he sensed his home was not far away, but only full-grown humans appeared. Many of them were in a field now. Some were down near the river bank, unrolling wires directly across from Gray, which made Pax uneasy. But the soldiers did not seem interested in anything except their labor. Pax learned their routine. Each morning 2 of them entered the tent that his senses told him was full of food. Then these 2 would cook at the fire, and the other war-sick would gather to eat. Afterward they all toiled, in the field, in the vehicles, unloading more and more machinery, but no one went near the grub tent until dusk, when the same 2 would cook the evening food and call the others together. It was mid-afternoon. Pax watched for a little while longer to be certain the war-sick were occupied, then crossed over the remaining span of rushing water along a fallen tree. Belly to the ground, he made his way across the ridge to a spot above the old mill. There he paused to survey the scene. 3 men were positioned at the encampment just below him. They huddled over new equipment on the south edge of the mill, where 2 thick walls met. The rest of the humans were in the field. Some rolled spools of wire to the holes they dug near the riverbank. Others lowered the boxes into those holes, then shoveled dirt over them. 2 paths had crossed the river. They were digging holes on the far bank, some directly below the hemlock where Gray was resting. Pax knew that the humans could not scent Gray, and that Gray would not venture out if they were near. Still, he bristled with anxiety. He would move the wounded fox to a safer place tonight. Pax started to the north edge of the mill ruins, near the tents and vehicles. There, a birch tree angled out from the stone wall. Pax stopped short. He had been here before. This place, the tree with its peeling white bark, the walls, the field below scented with wild onions and timothy grass and the faintest odor of tar. He recognized them all. He'd been here with his boy long ago, as a kit. The scene returned. Sticks. Peter and the other boys had rushed into each other from these stone walls, whooping and brandishing sticks. They'd been laughing, but those swinging sticks had made Pax uneasy. He'd shadowed Peter, yipping at the other boys when they came too near, until Peter tied him to this very tree. Pax had whined and chewed at the rope the rest of the afternoon. Peter had been here. Pix sniffed at the tree and the base of the wall thoroughly, but he could find no trace of his boy now. The war-sick men, though, their scent was everywhere, strong and dangerous. Pax's gut tightened. He checked the tents until he was certain there was no movement around them. Then he made a dash for the grub tent. At the corner he paused, checked again, and then slipped under a flap. Inside, meat hung from tables heaped with onions and potatoes, a bonanza for his taking. Pax sprang and seized a joint of ham, tearing it from its hook, and darted out of the tent with the heavy prize in his mouth. He ran hard uphill, behind the walls and through the back of the shrubby wood. At the river, he dropped the ham and gulped down a meal of the salty meat. He tore the joint apart and buried 2 large hunks in the sandy soil at the river's edge, and then marked the caches. He picked up the remaining piece, lush with meat and fat that would nourish Gray for days, and carried it over the fallen trunk. He paused on the pile of boulders to survey the cap again. The humans had disappeared. A new odor, faint but menacing, hung in the air. Pax recognized it. When he was a yearling, the father had brought a fan to his boy's room. Pax had hated the dark electrical scent coming off the wire between the fan and the wall. One night, when the odor was especially dangerous, Pax had chewed through the wire, as if killing a snake. Pax's every instinct urged him to run from the menacing scent, but he would not leave without Gray. Just then he saw the old fox stagger out from beneath the hemlock bough, making his way to the river. Gray tripped. Instantly the scorched air smell sizzled up from the spot like an earth-born bolt of lightning, and at the same second the riverbank exploded. Soil and rock and river and turf blew up with a furious roar, and then fell back to the cratered earth like a harsh black rain. Pax dropped the ham and barked for Gray. His ears rang in a shuddering silence. The war-sick poured out from behind the walls. From their cries, Pax knew they were excited. They ran down to the field, splashing across the river, spread out over the smoking bank. After a few moments of searching, they made their way back to camp. When the last of the war-sick had returned, Pax tore down the gorge. The great hemlock bough lay across Gray's chest, cleaved from the tree. Pax nosed his friend's muddy cheek, pawed his flank. He sniffed Gray's muzzle. There was breath there, but just barely. Pax lay down shoulder to shoulder with the old fox, pressing tight in full company. He could only offer witness, but nothing else was asked. Linked with Gray's final memories, he heard the song of an Arctic bird instead of human shouts. Instead of the ashy haze that hung over them, he saw Gray with a vast blue bowl of sky. Instead of lying on the gridded ground, he tumbled with Gray and his brother Kits across a snowy tundra spiked with starry blue flowers. He purred with Gray under his silver mother's rough tongue, tasting her warm milk, feeling the weight of her chin resting over the newborn skull. Then peace. The old fox was still. Pax rose. He pressed his forehead into his friend's cheek. He reared and bayed, heedless of whether the war-sick heard. Then he ran. There was no joy in the running this time, but there was relief that his body served him. He ran and ran, north through the dusk, north through the night. As dawn crested, he entered the challenger's territory, and still he ran. The yellow fox charged out to face him, but fell back from the determination of Pax's course and let him pass. Pax galloped down the cliff, tore across the valley bottom, and strained up the long rise to the meadow. Midway, he stopped and lifted his head. 3 foxes watched him approach. They were familiar to him now. Gray's mate, still big-bellied with kits. Runt, half her size, nearby. Bristle did not stand with them. Her bright fur shone at the base of the pine tree that towered over the meadow, under the pine where her sister had died. The scent of Gray's death was on Pax's fur, but the foxes knew it already. Pax padded up the rest of the way. When he reached Gray's den, he lifted his head and wailed the notes of grief. 3 foxes answered in kind. Gray's mate approached. She sniffed Pax's nose and then his flank. She learned of the fight, which did not kill her mate, and of the human's explosion, which did. She also learned that Pax had protected Gray, had fed him and cleaned his wounds, for which she was grateful. And then she learned the news Gray had died trying to obtain. It is not safe for us in the south? It is not safe. Gray's mate walked away, her belly swaying. His message delivered, Pax dropped to the grass exhausted. Runt came to claim the space beside him, and Pax was glad to allow the little fox to groom him. Bristle watched from the base of the pine above them. Pax slept fitfully through the afternoon, plagued by dreams in which his boy was tangled in smoking wires. Finally, as the moon rose in an indigo sky, he got to his feet. He breathed the scents of the foxes, linked in grief over the loss of their silver center. He was linked to them by the same grief, but he knew he would be welcomed in this valley if he chose to stay. But his dreams urged him back to the war-sick camp. As he was about to leave, he sensed Bristle tearing down the hill. He waited. "Where are you going?" Pax shared his new understanding that the exploding earth was war and that the fires caused death. He shared his fear that his boy might come upon them if he joined his father, his determination to protect Peter. These explosions, they would kill humans? Yes. She sprang around to face him. Then leave them. Pax ignored her. He gathered himself up and leaped. He hit the ground at a run. Chapter 18. Peter dropped from the beam when he caught sight of Vola limping through the rain toward the barn and tried not to look guilty. Vola was suspicious he'd been doing more than the exercises she'd ordered. He was, doubling them usually, and she wasn't happy about it. It takes a healthy adult 4 weeks to do what you're trying to do in 1. You're bound to hurt yourself, she'd warned him several times. In just these few days, it had become an old argument. He watched her shake off water in the doorway, and it reminded him of Pax, the dog-like way that he did that. Was it raining where he was? Would he still shake himself off if it was no warm, dry place to come into? Peter shivered and rubbed his arms. What's the matter? You look like you're in pain. Your arms hurt? No. Of course they did. But it was a good hurt, a soreness that meant he was getting closer to being strong enough to go. He dropped and did 3 push-ups, his cast resting on his left ankle. See? Fine. Can I do the obstacle course now? It's not raining as hard. No, you can't get the cast wet. I'll figure out some way to waterproof it before you leave, but for today, stay in here. You do all your drills already? Beam work, sack dragging, cinder blocks, all the core work you taught me. Vola nodded to the wall of marionettes. Why don't you practice then? Because those puppets don't get me a minute closer to my fox, Peter wanted to say. He sighed deeply and rolled his eyes instead. Vola was unmoved. How are you coming with them? Okay. Good, I mean. He practiced a few times and gotten a little better. The strings didn't tangle up anyway. Sometimes, though, the controls still worked exactly the opposite way he expected them to, and the puppets always looked twitchy, as if they were being electrocuted. But he had run out of patience. Let's do the show. I'm going to be leaving soon, Vola. Peter lifted the crutches, which moved as if they were extensions of his arms now. I made it to the ridge and back twice yesterday. I was on these things almost 6 hours. I would have done it in 8, except you took them away, remember? I'm ready to go. Vola dropped a handful of nails into an overall pocket and slid a hammer into her belt loop. Then she leveled him at a gaze. Show me how you work Sinbad. Peter gave another sigh, which Vola ignored again, and picked Sinbad off the wall. He swept the puppet over a bale of hay and dropped it onto the wooden egg in a big tin bowl that Vola had painted to look like a nest. He knew how clumsy it looked, but he sent her a hopeful glance. Really? That's the desperate hero, risking his life for the chance to escape a mighty rock? Vola took the controls from him, and instantly the marionette seemed to become flesh and blood. Think about what he wants. To escape, she said, as if Peter had asked for a lesson. Drop the arms and lead with them. Like this, see? Kind of low and sneaky. Have him slink down onto the nest until he's hidden behind the egg. Once he's there, you can let him go and fly the rock over the next nest from the other side. From the right, remember, so it doesn't tangle Sinbad's strings. Bring it down directly onto the egg, nice and slow, so the magnets in its talons catch hold of the ones in Sinbad's hands. They don't move like that for me. Why don't you just set up a mirror and watch yourself act it out? Vola glared at him. It's the 3rd condition, and it's not optional. Come over here. She carried the puppet to her workbench. He wants to move. All puppets want to move because I made them that way. You just have to show them how. Your muscles to theirs. Your muscles. Your muscles to theirs. Your muscles to theirs. She took off Sinbad's cloak. Then, to Peter's shock, she unstrung his wires. She reached for a screwdriver and disassembled the puppet until he was nothing more than a pile of scattered parts. Then she held the screwdriver out. Peter clamped the crutches under his armpits and raised his palms. You watched, didn't you? Yes, but I just stopped in for some tools. I'll be back in an hour. You'll have this puppet put together again, and you won't have any more problems after that. She slapped the screwdriver into his hand and left without another word. It wasn't actually that hard. The marionette's knees and elbows were simple one-way hinges, and the shoulders and hips carved wooden ball joints which Peter could see allowed for greater movement. The hands and feet were fastened with leather straps. The stringing was trickier, but once he figured out that the hands had to work off the control that moved like a dragonfly, he was able to figure out the others. And Vola was right. After he'd refastened Sinbad, he could move the puppet more smoothly. Your muscles to theirs, Vola had said, and sure enough, Peter was able to translate the movements he suggested through his own body to Sinbad's. Your muscles to theirs didn't work for the rock. Peter flexed his shoulders, swooped his arms, but the bird only lurched a few strokes and then fell as if it had been shot. The bird's glittering gaze seemed to reproach. I'm sorry, bird. I don't know what you're supposed to be doing, though. Are you trying to eat the guy? Are you protecting your egg? Suddenly, Peter wanted to know the rock story, wanted to get it right. He found the slot where Vola kept the Sinbad book. As he drew it out, he heard a quiet thunk. There was something behind the back of the niche. He pulled it out. A square tin, faded yellow and decorated with the peeling words, Sunshine Biscuits. He studied it on his palm and thought back to the battered cookie tin he'd found at his grandfather's, the one with its heap of soldiers guarding the surprising photo. He pried off the lid. Inside were a stack of index cards, scrawled with handwriting he'd come to recognize. He knew instantly that he held in his hand Vola's personal truths, the ones she kept hidden. He snapped down the lid, not wanting to invade her privacy. But it was too late. He'd read the top one. I would have been a good teacher. It wasn't a terrible truth, and it didn't even seem all that personal. Still, he wished he hadn't seen it. He pushed the tin back into the niche and slid the book in after it just as Vola came back in. He pointed to the marionettes. I've got it now. Let's do the scene. But Vola only walked to her workbench and poured oil on a whetstone. Not yet. We need a stage first. I'll put something together when I've got some free time. A stage? You didn't say anything about a stage. The marionettes don't just swing around in thin air over a couple of hay bales. She turned around and raised a palm to cut off Peter's protest. Listen, boy, I see the soldier's story the way it should be seen. You'll have to respect how much it means to me even if you don't understand it. Which you should, by the way. You carry that charm around. It's the same thing. You're telling the story of your mother's for her. But it will take so long. And there's no hurry. You're going to be here another week anyway. She clumped back to the workbench, sat down hard, and began selecting tools. Discussion over. Peter flung himself onto a stack of hay bales. Another week of this and he'd go crazy. The word struck him. He didn't think of Vola as crazy anymore. He propped himself up on his elbows and studied her as she polished her tools, noticing how carefully she'd lifted and cleaned each one. How, when she'd finished, she laid it precisely in its place. There was a calm purposefulness to her movements that he liked, a predictability. Francois waddled in and yawned. He climbed to a crotch in the rafters above the workbench and started watching himself before a nap. It occurred to Peter that, like Francois, he'd grown comfortable with Vola. Peter craned his head to see what she was making. A handle. She had brought a broken hoe, and she was giving it a new handle. A simple thing, and yet it struck him like almost magic. Like his crutches, before he'd had them, he'd been helpless. Vola had nailed a couple of boards together, and now he could swing over miles of rough country, quick and sure. Magic. He pulled the crutches over and braced them under his arms, feeling the familiar comfort their sturdy strength brought. He swung over to the workbench. I want to make something. Will you show me? Vola leaned back to study him hard. After what seemed a full minute, she nodded. No sense letting your brain go to rot. You know anything at all about working with wood? Carve away from yourself. I know that much. That's a start, but that's not what I meant. Vola chose a fresh block from her wood bin and centered it on the workbench. Who is the master here? Excuse me? Who is the boss? Me or the wood? Peter understood that this was a test. He was looking at the wood, blank and still, waiting. Then he looked at the neat arcs of gleaming tools, so eager to cut they seemed to tremble. You're the master. Vola nodded. She selected a spoon-tipped chisel and a mallet, then gave the block the same searching look she'd given him a few moments ago, as if she were trying to read some secret message below its surface. She tapped the chisel with some fresh wood. It cut with a clean snap, and a chiseled chip flipped onto the bench. She turned to Peter. And now? Who is the master now? Vola's face told him nothing. But the wood, its missing wedge, now a question demanding a response, spoke. The wood is, he said, certain. That's right, Vola agreed. From this moment on, the wood is the master. The carver is the servant to the wood. All craftsmen are servants to the craft. Once you decide what you want to make, the project is the boss. You know what you want to make? The answer came right away. How do you carve a fox? As soon as the words left his mouth, Peter braced for the answer he figured was coming, about how he should figure it out for himself. But Vola surprised him. Michelangelo once asked how he created one of his statues. He said, I saw the angel in the marble and I carved until I set him free. Might be a good way to think about it. Of course, if you're going to try to find a fox in the wood, you'll have to start with some wood. She motioned Peter to follow her to the wood bin. Different woods, different merits. Basswood's easy to carve, holds fine detail, but it's light. And it's light. I use it for the marionettes' heads. Now this pine is... White ash is good for baseball bats, Peter offered. It's really hard. Vola passed the pine block from one hand to another in silence for a moment. Speaking of which, she turned to Peter. You really don't own a bat? You love baseball, but don't own a bat? I'm a fielder. So what? You wait for someone to hit the ball and then you go get it? That's just reacting. Don't you want to hit too? That's not how it is. Once I've got the ball, I'm in control. I'm not reacting. I'm making choices. And I hit. The team has bats. You don't know baseball. Maybe I don't know baseball. She tossed the wood back into the bin with a shrug. But I'm starting to know you, and I think you need yourself a bat. Peter turned to the bin. He ran his hand through the blocks of wood while the image of blue glass shattering over white roses swept him. The image he could avoid if he stood at the plate, a team bat in hand, only by aiming his fiercest concentration at the pitcher's moves. If he owned his own bat again, every time he picked it up, he would see the shattering blue glass over those white roses, and it would wreck him. He lifted a honey-colored piece of wood, just the size of Pax when he'd found him. How about this? He asked, his breathing tight. It's rippled, like fur. She looked as if she was biting her lip against more of the bat debate. Butternut, she said finally. Beautiful grain. Soft enough. You study it for a while. We'll carve tomorrow. Late at night, as he was about to climb into his hammock, bone-weary, Peter saw the block of wood he'd propped on the windowsill earlier. He'd barely thought about Pax all day. Guilt swept him. He was becoming foxless, something he hadn't been since he was 7 years old. It had taken a lot longer. A year and 16 days to be exact. He'd figured it out. For a day to go by when he didn't think of his mother. On that day, he'd gone with a friend's family on a camping trip. They'd gotten into canoes in the morning and fished and swum and pitched tents and grilled hot dogs. Only when he climbed into his sleeping bag under the stars had his disloyalty struck him. He'd worried that night that he deserved to be motherless. He pulled her picture out from his pack. Her birthday, the kite. one of the very good memories. The kite hadn't flown. He'd been 6 years old, and really it wasn't anything more than a picture of a dragon taped to some popsicle sticks. Even at that age, he had known that if his father had been there, somehow his kite's failure would have ruined the afternoon. But he wasn't there, and his mother had just laughed about it, and they'd spread a blanket on the hill and made a picnic of peanut brittle and grape juice and made up story after story about the paper dragon who was too wise to go flying off into the air when so many other adventures were waiting for him on the ground. Peter set the photo on the sill beside the block of wood. He closed his eyes. He needed to visit some of the memories of Pax, too. Pax waiting at the door of his pen whenever Peter got home because he learned the whine of the school bus brakes. Nosing through his backpack for apple cores. Peeling out of his sweatshirt pocket. Peter had snuck him into school once. In 2nd grade, he hadn't really thought of the consequences to the kit, but had only wanted the secret comfort of his company. There had been a fire drill, and the alarm had terrified Pax. Peter had been sent home, and his father had been angry. But the way the kit had shivered and mewed had been the true punishment. The best memory was a quiet one. The winter before last had been cold, with long stretches when Peter hadn't wanted to leave the fireplace to do his homework. It had been so cold that his father had relented and allowed Pax inside early to stretch out beside close to the fire. Pax would doze with his muzzle and front paws getting so hot that Peter kept checking them. Peter remembered his knuckles drifting down as he read his history text to knead the fur between his pet shoulder blades. Peace. He opened his eyes and lifted the butternut block, and in the pale light of the moon, he saw the fox in the wood. Thank you for joining me. We'll see you again. Bye-bye.